Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the News Behind the News with Raf Kantav on Mix 94.7 FM, and thanks for joining me on today's program. I am extremely happy to have a good friend here with me and a co-host on our mini podcast with someone who's just a phenomenal young woman and that's doing quite a bit of amazing things here in St. Martin with a great love and passion for this island as well, and that is Miss Carla Vlaun. How you doing, Carla? And thanks for being on the program.
I'm good, Ralph. Thank you so much for having me and for that wonderful introduction.
No problem. There's a lot I can say about you, and I think also there's a lot you could that we can talk about. It's good that we've always been back and forth with each other in a sense, discussing different topics. So thanks again for coming on the program. But to start off, could you tell us a bit about yourself, and we'll move on from there.
Okay, so as you already introduced me, my name is Carla Vlaun. I'm 27 years old, from St. Martin. I went to Learning Unlimited my whole primary high school life, and when I graduated, I moved to The Hague in the Netherlands to Leiden University College, where I studied world politics, and that was a great 3 years of my life, but then I decided I didn't want to stay within the kingdom, so I decided to pursue my master's in Geneva, Switzerland, at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, where I then got my master's in international affairs. And so even from when I was young at LU, I was always, I would say, very privileged to have a lot of opportunity to be able to travel and represent St. Martin in different competitions. So I think this international affairs aspect was always something that was in me and that I was finding within myself as I did my tertiary education. And the epitome of that was reaching, the center of international affairs in Geneva and going to school every day right next to the United Nations. And that was just an amazing and enriching opportunity to be able to meet so many people from all around the world. It's probably the most diverse place I've ever been to. And I mean, it taught me so much and it gave me so much. And I think that a very short 2 years of my life really shaped a lot about me and how I came to see the world, how I came to understand myself, and also the things I started to care more about St. Martin, because like you mentioned, I mean, I've always been passionate about St. Martin and St. Martin history and representing the island and how the island is represented. But it's really in my master's program and my experience in Geneva that really started to take shape, and I started to understand, okay, what do I want to do? Because it's great to say that you love St. Martin, but you love St. Martin, and then what?
Yeah, love is action word, right?
Yeah, exactly. So after that, I actually came back to St. Martin to do an internship at the Social Economic Council and to write my thesis, which was on the historical development of Carnival. And then Hurricane Irma happened. And I stayed for a little bit, but then I decided that, I wanted to find a job straight out of my master's. I wasn't able to attend my graduation because it was like 3 days after Irma, I think. So couldn't get out. So I Zoomed back then, but it wasn't Zoom, into my graduation.
So you were a trailblazer, basically.
I was already getting my toes wet in that department. And then I moved back to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, where I worked for World Press Photo Foundation. And I got to travel the world for them as an exhibition manager and curator. And that, again, just continued to shape my knowledge of what was possible, which was everything. And it really it took applying my study in a very different way, because of course it's the world of photojournalism, and it's something that I had never taken as a interest or a hobby until I started working for them. And then I found a whole new world and realized how much the things that I was studying related to that work at World Press Photo. And I took all those experiences with me and came back in 2019 to work for the SARE.
Great. And I know before that you also interned with the Department of Foreign Relations as well?
Yes, I did. So I got to do 2 internships for them, actually. So once in my bachelor and then once right before my master's. And that was great. I got to work with DBB on their human rights portfolios, and I was able to create a human rights matrix, because basically throughout the years and constantly, the United Nations is all countries are required to respond to human rights conventions that they're party to, and the recommendations that's given to countries to fix to be more in line with human rights conventions. So I got to work with trying to create a system for government to track all the human rights recommendations coming in and distributing how those recommendations have to be seen across the ministries, because of course DBB is like this of communication point, I would say, between the international and the local. And so they have to make sure, it's not DBB enacting the international human rights law, it's the different ministries that have to do the work, and they're the intermediary space between that. So it was a really enriching opportunity as well, and also helped me, become more grounded in my study at the time. Yeah,
which I think is a great benefit for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you gave me that introduction, because it leads into quite a lot of the questions I have here lined up. One of them being in particular, I was going to ask, I'm curious of where your interest in politics started, but perhaps it's with it's with your late father, Charlie Vlaun?
So growing up, there were so many different political figures that I would see walk in and out of our house and out of my dad's office. And I think the word that always described me as a child was probably a bottom fly to my parents. So I was always there. My dad always kept me around. And so he was never someone who said that I needed to leave the room when he was talking about certain topics. So I'm really grateful for that. And I was able to get firsthand experience through that, not just on politics, but really the stories of St. Martin, right? Because that's what politics is. It's saying what is the story of St. Martin and how do we have to act on that. And so from young, I wasn't asked what my opinion was, but I gave it. And that's where it all started. To the point that eventually my father started becoming more careful about the things that he said around me.
Don't want to radicalize you too early.
No, and he also didn't want me to go. I remember one story where I remember he was having a conversation, and we then met that person outside, and he was like, oh, saying all these great things. And I was like, but Dad, yesterday you were saying, and he was like, oh my gosh, like... But it was a learning experience, my first maybe experience in diplomacy and when to say things and when not to say things. But I think that most of all, what my dad showed me was just an undenying love for the St. Martiner. He was always, his politics was helping people. And he had different visions from the persons that he ran with or against at the time. He was very much in favor of like a tax system and a social system that looked much like Bermuda.
Interesting.
Yes.
You gotta look that up now.
And I never saw him shy away from situations of helping people, So I think that was the most important political message that you could get about anything, right? It's one, knowing where you stand on things, but then two, knowing that you're there for love of people.
Great. So I'm curious then as well, what was it like learning about him, and how and also the impact of his legacy in your life? Yeah.
He passed away when I was 9. So I can honestly say I never really thought about who my dad was before he passed away. And after he died, I really had a lot of people come up to me like, your father's such a great man. He did this and this for me, da-da-da. And I think after 2 years of hearing about how such a great man your father is, I started to get aggravated, because you wanted to experience these things for yourself, and so I felt very much like cheated out of a reality to get to know like this great person. And I think that I had to, over many years, and I think it probably only happened after I turned 18 and went away, that I started to get like a positive idea of wanting to search for the stories of my father. And it's actually Suja Reef who who pointed me in that direction when I was doing the research for my bachelor's, and he was like, "Your father was what I would define as a monumental tree, as one of those monumental people that St. Martin wouldn't be St. Martin without." And I think at that point I started to shift and say, okay, I need to start listening more to the stories that came my way. But before, it was hard to think that a lot of people were using the story of my father to apply pressure to who I should be and the footsteps that I need to fill. And it was very aggravating in a sense to not know what those footsteps even were. People would come to me and say, you know, like your father did this or started this company. And I'm like, what? You know, just adding like another story to the so many that I already had. And it was very overwhelming. And I felt also cornered to fit within a certain path. And it was really the conversation that I had with Suja that turned me around to discover who he was, not just for myself, but for St. Martin as a community, you know, and that really started to change my perspective.
Gotcha. And how was it like? Well, actually, have you actually put together all the, let's say, stories and stuff that you got from him, and what are some of those that still, you know, stood out to you the most? One in particular, perhaps.
I mean, I didn't dedicate a lot of time to it, I have to say. I continue to take people's stories, and when they come my way, I write them down. I went through a lot of the stuff that my dad left behind. I mean, we have so much papers and letters, so I could really see
like his expression.
Yeah, like the way that he would express things, but also like the things that he would dream about, you know, because it's like, I mean, it's his Bible, and he has like notes in the columns, or he had like this notepad, and it's just a bunch of random ideas, and you get to know into someone's psyche more that way. But I think for me, it's just sometimes really the random act of kindness. So I was standing outside Costulas one day, and someone just came up to me, and he's like, "You're Charlie Vaughn's daughter." And I said, "Yeah, I am." I still get surprised when people can identify you like years after so easily.
They know who you are.
Yeah. And he was like, you know, I just knew your father in passing, but I had a grave health issue that I needed to be solved, and I didn't have the funds. And he went into what the health issue was, and it was really life-threatening, He didn't work for my dad. My dad just knew him in passing, My dad paid all of his medical expenses to have it done, you know, and it was to no benefit of himself, but just for a life, right? And for me, it's in those small ways that, you know, we're not here on this earth just for ourselves. And when you really find your purpose, it's also in those small, very big acts that people show that they're really here because they love people, and I think that story really moved me more than I could have ever thought that it would have. Just because, you know, like you think, would you yourself do this? You know, like, and to know that he had that much kindness in him, and I know that every great man also has his faults. So I'm not here to say everyone is, or that he wasn't without fault. But those stories continue to inspire me to collect things. And maybe one day I'll do something more substantive, but I think that it inspired me more to collect the stories of those who are still alive, and to sit down with older generations to make sure that our history and our stories are not dying with persons.
Yes. I'm glad you said that, because I wanted to lead into that next. But before I do, one of the things I'm curious about, though, you know, you said that you know, you were one of those who went to LU from primary to high school. Also, in a sense, what was that like? You know, especially since, you know, I'm pretty sure you're very much overwhelmed in a sense of you hear a whole lot more stories of persons talking about being, you know, going to school at MPC, Academy, maybe Sundial, some St. Dominic, but LU is like, you know,
I mean,
kind of.
I was there from when I was 2 to 17, so really my entire life, or life, childhood. There you go. And it was very interesting to go out into public and introduce yourself. And then I remember as a teenager, people always saying like, "Oh, but you're so kind." And I'm like, what? You know, like, oh no, but I would think people from LU are stuck up or this or that. But it was not like once or twice. Yeah, it was like 20 times, you know, that I would get this reaction. I'm like, I don't understand. But then, of course, you get older and you come to understand privilege. And of course, it was very hard. Also, even for my mom, after my dad passed, to keep me at LU, it is an expense. But it was one, you know, it was a school that helped me along the way they wanted me to be developed. You know, my dad really thought that I would want to go to an American university. I don't know why.
Yeah, because
I went in the complete opposite direction.
Not even a semester abroad.
Yeah. But he had that vision for me, and I did not live up to that expectation. But it was very strange to enter certain social circumstances and be excluded. But as a kid, I didn't understand it, and those things you understand much later, the privilege that comes into certain conversations. And I would say that even within school systems, you always see, like, there's levels on levels of privilege, you know? And I can only say good things about my educational experience at LU. I was really fortunate that because of the potential that they saw in me, they really pushed me forward for everything. So I think I remember when I was like 15 or 16, I was crying like burnout. I didn't want to do anything anymore because I felt like I was doing science fair, I was doing debate, I was doing this, and I didn't know, like, out of all the things that I was doing, what I wanted to do, you know. And I didn't focus on the fact that they were allowing me to do everything. And that was something that was so great. And I think it really helped then when I went into interdisciplinary study to have those experiences. But it's definitely one of privilege. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just was curious, you know, because I've had many persons here, and, you know, everyone would, in a sense, maybe share a bit about their school experience, but it's not that often you get someone to talk about what it's like, you know, going to LU in that sense.
Yeah.
But we also, and as you rightly said, that just the makeup of our society too, you know.
It's a small school,
both sides
too.
you have, you know, a sort of exclusion, you know, in a sense. So, yeah.
Because I think from preschool up until 12th grade when I was there, we were 200 students, or 200 or 300. But I mean, a really small number, you know. Yeah. So it's not odd that you don't come across someone who graduated from LU too often. But I definitely think that choosing a school system, it one has to do with resources, but also, like, if you want your kid to go into the American system, it makes a lot of sense to go to LU because they prepare you for exactly that, you know. But
immediately streamlined. Yeah.
So I think that was really helpful. But there is, like, a huge emphasis on U.S. universities. I don't know if it's changed. I know from the year before me, I think, and the years after, a lot of us started going to Holland, you know. I think just the financial bill of any U.S. institution is just a lot for anybody, you know, like. It's crazy to think of going to the best institution in the US, you pay $60K a year, and in the Netherlands, the best institution was 1,700 euros a year. Yeah. You know, so...
usually with those institutions, it's, you know, in some cases, built on those families who have endowments you know, for generations, like, you know.
There's a really great... revisionist history podcast episode by Malcolm Gladwell that's exactly on the US ranking system, and I really recommend everyone listens to it because they really showed how basically they could estimate the rankings of US universities based solely on endowment funds.
Wow.
So it's not really about the education when you're looking at those lists.
That's true. You know, capitalism.
Yeah.
So so one of the things, so before we talked about that, you basically stated that, you know, you grew in wanting to interview persons, especially not allowing history to die with people, which is so significant and important because, we have and we've had lots of living encyclopedians in St. Martin, people who knew everything about everything, about the island, and but they have slowly been passing. There are some persons who, in a sense, were never recorded, but had a wealth of knowledge. So I'm curious about how has that been for you, and how do we strike that balance between keeping our tradition of oral history alive, but at the same time formalizing it, into educational material.
Yeah, I know you know the story, but when I did my bachelor thesis and I collected oral histories, I had a professor ask me if by writing my thesis down in paper, if I was not doing a disservice to my culture. And it really started to get me thinking about the fact of how we traditionally pass on information and how we then consider representing that information, right? So it is, we cannot deny the fact that there are hierarchies to passing on information. When you pass on things orally, within academia, there is this connotation of it being the practice of the illiterate. You're collecting oral histories because people can't write for themselves or can't read for themselves. And so there's always this emphasis in at least historical research in academia for the written text. And so it really started to get me thinking about how do we stay true to ourselves but still remain within this era of you need things documented and down on paper. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the right answer to that, but I do know that technology is now evolving in a way where people are watching videos, people are looking at photos on Instagram, we want to watch TikToks to learn about things, so we're actually going back in the direction that, our culture has always been in.
Especially with podcasting.
Exactly. Yeah. So, our culture has always been there. And so how are we making sure that we're utilizing these technologies that are coming out to make sure that we are documenting the traditional and the historical? So those are questions that I'm constantly asking myself. I don't have any answers,
That's cool.
But I think it's conversations that we need to keep having, and I think it's something that ended up birthing the podcast that we're both on, Mele. Yeah. But it's, you always have to ask yourself how you end up changing something with an end product, and how does that end product reflect culture and identity at every stage.
Yeah. So I'm glad you said that, because curious if you don't mind sharing as well your interest or perhaps approach in developing material as well, teaching material.
So there is a lot of calling and interviewing that goes into finding information. I think that it takes a lot of work to undo the processes that we went on through university, that the first thing you do is Google. That doesn't always work when you're trying to find information about St. Martin. So, you go to your one go-to person,
Mm-hmm.
the person that will point you in the right direction, even if they don't have the information. And so that's how it starts. And I think that it's also a privilege to be able to say that you have those kind of phone numbers in your phone. And when we're talking about St. Martin, that has a largely immigrant population, how are we keeping information and stories away from the broader population by keeping it in the hands of a few, and it also limits access. So I consider it humbling that, older persons will take the time to sit down and tell me things. But then you document and you research and you try to see if you can connect dots, find someone else that can corroborate the same story or say the same thing, and see if you can find archives, but that's often very rare. A lot of times also, for example, when I did research at the Royal Library in the Netherlands, there's a wealth of knowledge on Suriname, a wealth of knowledge on Curacao. And then St. Martin's like a sneeze.
That's funny because, for example, I mean, St. Martin, yes, it may be smaller than all of them, but it has had such a huge contribution. And it just has a dynamic story, period,
And I think also one thing is that in working through the Colonial Archive and in reading a lot about it, you also come to learn that there are huge colonial files on moments of problems, and sometimes I start to wonder, what were the issues going on St. Martin? We basically went through a economic lull in the global sense from emancipation to the 1960s.
60s, yeah.
And so if there weren't issues, if there weren't social uprisings, it also doesn't create like these upticks in the colonial archive. Whereas, for example, if you go through the colonial archive on Indonesia, I mean, you have, for example, huge documentations on persons who were, and there's a Dutch scholar who writes about it, huge upticks on, for example, following all persons who are of Dutch heritage but born in Indonesia, because there was this idea that they might be the ones to guide dissent or revolution, or that they might prove problematic moving back to the Netherlands because they were actually cultured in Indonesia, So if you didn't have an entity saying that this event or these people are problematic, there's no documentation in the colonial archive. There's no need to write things down. And so I don't know if that's also what also played into a lot of absence of information about the Dutch side, I'd say specifically, because I know that it seems like French archives have much more about the French side. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so for those of you who maybe just tuning in, I'm joined here with Miss Carla Vlaun, policy advisor and a history enthusiast. So we're going to take a quick break and then we'll be right back with more. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the News Behind the News with Rav Kintav on Mix 94.7 FM. And thanks for joining me on today's program as I'm here with Miss Carla Vlaun. And so I'd like to remain on the topic of history, but kind of delving into media. I always say, for example, journalism is history in the present, because what is reported on today becomes, historical fact. So you were a, let me see how it's written, exhibition manager and curator for World Press Photo. And one of the things I'm curious about is that as a writer, you're always filled with the desire to put as much as you can into a piece. But with photography, you allow the story to tell you allow the image to tell a story for you. So what have you learned about photojournalism that makes it a genre that still stands against the test of time?
I think that in my experience working for World Press Photo and getting to have conversations with, some of the most prestigious or award-winning photojournalists in the world, you come to learn that sometimes words don't capture it all. And I think that a lot of times when you see photos, there's this idea that a photo will push someone to action, like really seeing what's happening to a people or to an environment is somehow going to push people that extra mile beyond the words in this New York Times article. And the dangerous part with that I was able to see through that work is that photos also come to play within our own visual language that we learn, right? So media literacy is something that is so important and really needs to be taught in schools, because we don't realize, or we don't talk enough about the fact that when the only images you would see of Black persons is on ads for UNICEF or these different organizations that are trying to rally funds for, the poor people in Africa. For the radio listeners that are not watching the video, I did air quotes. Please note the sarcasm. we don't talk enough about the work that does to shape how persons then see all Black people. And I'll remember one experience that always stayed with me is that when I set up the exhibition, and I can speak more about that so that this all makes sense, but when I set up an exhibition in a city one day, there was this beautiful photo series that was taken by a photojournalist whose name is Anna Boyasis. And she traveled to Zanzibar, which has one of the highest rates of drowning in the world, or deaths by drowning. And she captured women and girls learning how to swim. And they are from Muslim communities, so they're wearing the burkinis. And they're floating in the water, and they're holding empty tomato sauce cans to be able to learn how to float. And so when you set up the exhibition, you like to see how people move around it. Did you design it right, etc.? And I see this mom stop with her kids and just look at the photos and say, it's a photo of refugees in the Mediterranean. And I think the wonderful thing about working with World Press Photo is that yes, photos speak a million words, but we really make sure that part of the process is researching a topic and making sure that they are informed and factually accurate captions provided with each photo. So I just thought, this is crazy. This woman saw this image, saw Black bodies and water, and that within her mind equaled refugees in the Mediterranean. There was no use to read the captions because she saw a photo that spoke exactly to the visual language that she sees on TVs. And
the narrative that was very creative.
Exactly. So, I mean, this photo series came after probably 2 to 3 years of seeing large amounts of news coverage about the refugee crisis, right, and refugees crossing the Mediterranean. And I just thought, this is absolutely crazy, you know. So we don't realize the work that images do. And sometimes you have to realize that, you know, we have to be more critical about the images that we receive. And now it's that more than ever, not just because we're just looking at images, but we're also receiving doctored images, etc.
Definitely.
So I think that my experience with World Press Photo was completely enriching in just the sense that, you know, when I motivated my CV or wrote my motivation in my CV to work there, it was really about learning what it's like to be in an environment in which you had to expand the narrative in which people received about a situation. And I remember in my interview, my boss said, you know, how do you feel about the fact that, you know, there is going to be a time where there might be a photo series that wins, and you're going to say that this image is very exclusive and demeaning even towards a given situation to how you see it. And that one depiction will travel, and you're going to have to work with that, you know? And at the time I told them, I mean, I would see it as my job as the curator, that at least for the time that I'm on the ground, I'm there to help provide a picture along with the information also provided by World Press Photo to explain where a photo is situated. But it takes a lot of constant work and discussions, and as you travel around the world, you realize that there are conversations that certain cultures want to have, and there are certain cultures that there's conversations that they don't want to have, you know. So a big thing was nudity, homosexuals,
religious practices, probably.
Religious practices weren't so much of an issue, but it was an issue sometimes if a religious practice was portrayed in a certain way, right?
Like the typecast it.
Yeah. And so sometimes, you know, a partner would say, can we hide that image like around the corner where like no one goes? And you're like, okay, no. You know, that was the one deal with World Press Photo. You want the exhibition, you take the whole exhibition. So it also became like sensitive when you're working in certain institutions that might not want certain photos, or cultures that might not want to work with certain photos. But it's also the job of the organization to talk about, you know, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. So it was great to be within an environment that, you know, allowed you to work so closely with the topic of journalism, but also human rights, to think about the way that you have to communicate across cultures and countries, and, you know, the sensitivities that you have to have. I mean, I can't begin to explain the stories of being I think I was 21, 22 at the time, traveling the world and then reaching on a site and it's an all-male crew and they see you and what they see in their head is a child, you know? You are so young, who are you, you know? And you have to command respect and show them like, hey, I'm here because I know my stuff, you know? And you're here to do your job and we're going to work together and we're going to create something amazing together. So I think that was also very enriching to see, you know, the way that you get to connect with people, also across ages and how you have to command authority and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But it always worked out in the end and it was a great experience.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things I'm glad you share that because in particular looking at media, news, journalism development here in St. Martin, lots of room for improvement, but especially given the fact that you know you were involved with World Press Photo. I'm curious about the application of those concepts here, but also the way in which we incorporate our story in global geography.
Yeah, I think that there's two things that I took away from World Press Photo, and that was. Or when I think about the St. Martin context, and the two things that I think of are one, independence of the media and how important that is, and two, the power of narrative creation. And so for the first one, I mean, it is so important to have an independent media, and in a small country, in a small space, in a small community, it becomes very hard, because can you come out and truthfully talk about a situation and what's that going to do for you financially, reputation wise, and these are questions where in larger societies persons can be a bit more protected than here in St. Martin, and I think that it's also a value that came along with the development of journalism within different countries. The idea of the independence and the separation between media and the states, because of course for some countries there is no media without states.
Thank God it's very few.
Yes, but it's asking for ourselves, where do we want this conversation to go in St. Martin? Because you don't want to, in a sense, say that every day we need to tear down everything that's going on. It's not to say that we have to just deconstruct everything until there's nothing there, but it's very much like our political scene. I mean, you see that newspapers abroad also have goals and visions, and they are also open and honest about those things.
Yeah.
And so how are we interacting with those conversations as a community? And then two, I think the biggest example was after Irma. I mean, we had a communications blackout. Mm-hmm. And then we suddenly entered a narrative that was already created by the Netherlands, right? So things were so bad. I remember they said, like, it looks just like a war zone, like all these things. And we weren't able to react to this, and looting and etc. And they painted this narrative with their media. And then St. Martin just entered that conversation, And at some point you have to say, you have to stop entering other people's conversations. You have to determine, okay, what is the narrative that we want for ourselves? Like, if we're heading in a certain direction as a country, what are the things that, as the media, we need to document recurrently? When government falls, there needs to be an article of the histories of government falling and why they fell and why it's falling this time, for people to always situate themselves in the present. Yeah. Exactly. And so you see that across like different news that helps you, or not helps you, but the work is narrative work. It's saying where we're going, who are we, constantly.
Yeah.
And that's something that sometimes myself, and speaking personally, I feel like out of bounds within St. Martin. Like, you're just being bombarded with a lot of information about what's going on, and sometimes it just seems like random and etc. And
details and depth into
exactly. And so that certain things have happened before, but it's like that information should also be on the page, but now I have to go into your archive as a news site, and I'm going to be honest, most news sites have pretty bad archives when you're trying to search through like what they've written on before. And so it only becomes like for the super interested to be able to make those connections. But we know like that the average citizen is going to read what's on the page that day, situate it within that day. So it is also the work of the media to help situate stories within larger narratives.
Yeah, because journalism is not easy work.
No, it's
it may
not.
seem that way.
Yeah.
From experience, sometimes, especially if you're going to partly focus on investigative journalism, it could take a good week or more to just get one story done. You know, and I really appreciate what you said about the shaping of narrative, because you can't just be deconstructing indeed, because there has to be some building taking place. That's why it's also important to broaden the spectrum of reporting, to highlighting what is individual profiles, but even events, and even settings in the country as well. But then also, I think what matters is like what you have right now, where you tend to see a lot of press release journalism. They just copy paste a little edits here's the information, but not the exploration, the deep dives into a topic.
And I think that that's where you really start to develop the psyche of a people that live in a territory. It's in the more that you provide to this is what happened today. Because the other day, for example, I was watching the French news when the war in Ukraine first broke out. And they had a 2-hour schedule discussing about how Emmanuel Macron's response to the war in Ukraine was all about his presidential positioning, so positioning himself as a candidate for re-election, and the way that he responds and everything he's thinking about to respond, everything is about his re-election. And then I just thought, this is crazy, because you are, or not this is crazy, but you see exactly then like the way that particular media was working on its narrative. Its narrative and its function was, and its top agenda point was French elections. No matter what's happening in the world, we need to make sure voters or the people of France know there's an election coming up. They need to vote for a president, and everything is connected to this election. Whereas very much you could have then turned to a different news site that completely put this in, for example, the history of the USSR relations and NATO. And so you see how different media takes the day that's happening and the news that's happening today and links it to what it wants you to look at, and be aware of. And so you see how psyches are formed through that. And, the media is a very powerful tool, and it's not neutral.
Why, quite a bit of billionaires across the world have been buying up newspapers.
Media companies. Exactly.
A legacy paper like the Washington Post, for example, democracy dies in the darkness.
Exactly. So, and we know the power of it. And so it's also to ask ourselves, it's also not like in a negative way. There is a beauty in having a narrative. And I think like even in the history of the nation state, right, because countries didn't always exist. And in the history of countries coming to being, what was the biggest tool that united a people? Newspapers, because they told people that it doesn't matter if you live on the east of a country and you're never going to meet someone who lives on the west, but you are one. And like there's this image that everyone in the country at 9:00 is reading that same paper with a cup of coffee in their hand or a cup of tea or whatever. So newspapers and the media have always been a tool in uniting people. And so that comes with its negative narratives and the positive ones. Yeah,
I'm glad you said that as well. Also, because one of the things I've been kind of repeating is as it relates to, a level of darkness in our society where information is clearly being withheld or just poorly structured or translated. And one of the things that touches on that is something you initiated, which was the Questionnaire of Decolonization, because here you have a topic of national concern, which in its start in Parliament, it was already kind of cunningly put together because the entire body wasn't notified of it. But then it was just dropped on the people, but without consideration per se. And I even remember one of the members of parliament stating on the radio, interestingly, like, yeah, well, we didn't have to consult the people first. And, with that came about a whole set of stuff. But I found it beautiful when you created that questionnaire, because here you have now testimonials of people from various background ages, curious about what this was about, the impact on their life, because absolutely no information was given to them about it.
Yeah. So when the petition was sent to the United Nations bodies, one of the United Nations bodies, it came as a surprise to a lot of people. And a lot of people came to me with questions just because they knew that I was interested in the topic in general and kind of knew how the United Nations works. So when it first happened, I myself reached out to friends who I knew were working with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights to understand, okay, this petition was sent in, what does it mean? How is it received? How is it taken? But then I started to get more and more questions. So I said, I want to do this in a structural way. So I sent out this link and persons could send in their questions about the petition and decolonization in general. I was able to then share that with parliamentarians before the lawyer who conducted who sent in the petition came into Parliament. I believe some MPs also asked questions towards the lawyers directly from the questions that were posed by the public. But I think the biggest learning experience in that was that when I was going through the questions myself, or the questions that were sent in response to asking the public what are their questions about this, is that we just had a huge lack of information about how our system works. So it's I started to ask myself, because the perfect trajectory would have been, I got the questions, I scheduled a day of events in which people could come and listen to lectures, because I love lectures. And then suddenly we have our questions answered about decolonization. Perfect trajectory, right? But then I started to say, how do I even discuss something on this level when people's questions were about very basic understandings of how our governing system works, right? Questions pointed to what is the role of governor? What is the role of parliament? What is the role of the CFT? All institutions that we have in operation. It's not even things to come or things that could come from the petition. It's stuff that's already been there since 10/10/10 and possibly before. And we didn't understand them. So from that moment, I had to kind of knock myself and say, the goal is that you want as many people to take part in a discussion about where they want to go with where they live and who they are. And so how do you partake in that discussion so that when you're having a conversation about decolonization, people feel much more authority and control over their country, because these 16 square miles that our government governs, there isn't a lot to it. So people should know how it functions and works. And even if they don't know or don't really care, if they go on Google and they search for it, it should be there. So that's how I started on one route and got moved to another to say that, we need to do the groundwork first. And I was lucky enough to take over the Infomedia Foundation. And so we'll be looking to do more projects towards that in general. The foundation itself, its mission is to educate and provide information to the people of St. Martin for their upliftment. And how can we create materials that really shows people the shape of their country and tells them, this is your country, and once its boundaries, it makes it much more simpler, or an idea that, this is what you have to work with. I remember when I told someone, a classmate from Lagos, Nigeria, in my graduate program, that I was from St. Martin. He said, how many people are there on St. Martin? And I was like, 40,000. He was like, that's how many people come to my church on Sunday. I didn't believe him. I Googled it. Indeed, he goes to a mega church where on one Sunday service, 40,000 people come in.
Jeez.
So when you start to put things in perspective, it also helps you to, not to say like that St. Martin's problems are so small, because we're a small place with the same problems as every large country. But it also has to constantly put it in perspective, that this is like an area and an amount of people that you can do implementable change and see the change. It won't take long. And so those kind of
That's
ideas, continue to inspire me and empower me as I go through a journey of also working together with my peers and colleagues to figure out, like, how are you going to insert yourself in this discussion to one, enter a discussion where Caribbean countries or islands in general went through, like, in the 70s. And to speak to the new technologies that we're receiving information in today, to appeal to the youth. Let me tell you, we know from doing different talks, but you want to stay relevant, and you want to be relevant, and you want to figure out
same old approach.
No, you want to figure out, like, how are you going to create the most impact? Because it's not just to say, I don't want to say just one day, like, okay, like, I wrote this thing and, like, people can search it and that's all the work I did. It's really about creating impact. How do you get people to interact with something? Like, at the end of the day, I might say, like, it would be great if every student who graduated high school could quote to you, like, every ministry, who's the minister, every high council, who's the chairperson of that high council, all those things, to also create pride in like where your country has reached and who these persons who, grew up in these same spaces, like the things that they do and the things that they achieve. But, as long as I get them to think and question, or to just have a thought, like, indeed, like, I'm in this space, and how do I see myself in this space, and what do I care about in this space, that's enough. Just getting young people to figure out, like, where do they want to go, and to know that they are backed by persons in the community, that they have access to information, that they can figure it out on their own.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that too, because what comes to mind is, we often hear the conversation of the brain drain, and indeed there are quite a bit of persons abroad who, can come back home and do a lot of great stuff. But at the same time, you do have people back here, some who came back right away, even, to pull up their sleeves and give back and help take some out and further. So that's something as well that has to be also portrayed. Because I think that my favorite thing to think about when it comes to the brain drain is just every country builds its curriculum so that students can become laborers in that country. Education has to match your economy. We are this super unique place where we have a bunch of different education systems that some teachers are working to make, like, hybrid systems to give them little sprinkles of St. Martin in there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I could say that I could have moved to the U.S. and been a perfect U.S. citizen, because I knew the institutions, I knew the language, I knew the shape of society, I knew how to vote there. Did I know any of those things about St. Martin? No. So the information that you give students to tell them who they are and how their curriculum shapes them also plays a role into brain drain, right? Because if you teach someone how to perfectly exist in another society, when they reach that society, they're going to feel like, hey, I fit in here. Not only can I maybe get, like, a higher salary or whatever, but I know the shape of the society and what it means to be Dutch or what it means to be American, And so we have to make sure that we're passing that on to our kids, because when I did a research for the SARE, when I did my internship, I researched how is history being taught in schools in St. Martin. A lot of the responses that I got in those interviews from students were just like, why learn about St. Martin? Like, we don't care. Like, we're going away to study. So, like, learning about St. Martin isn't going to help my university degree. Like, things like this. So, if those are the sentiments being felt, it's also to say, like, we have as a society, not just government, but as a society on a whole, have not taught our young people that these are the things that you should care about, because it's true. Like, at what point
will a young child look up to their parents and say, like, you don't know St. Martin history, you don't know about voting in St. Martin, and you haven't like succeeded in life. People are succeeding every day without this information and knowledge, right? So you have to create a need. Otherwise, kids are going to see. We're expecting kids to seek it themselves.
Correct.
And
it can't be that way. We have to educate them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely have to educate them. And then finally, what I will share is one of the things that you did. Too bad the time has basically passed, but you self-published your master thesis, which delved into Carnival. And so I guess real quick, can persons be able to get that from you, and then how was that like as well? What really stood out to you, throughout that throughout that research, and why in particular that you focus on Carnival?
Yeah. So in international affairs, when I was doing my master's, my focus was on civil and transnational issues. So that's really looking at international affairs really from the ground up, like how do the people of a country start movements that bleed across borders. And so I had what I thought I would never find, which was a Caribbean history professor at my university in Geneva, and her name is Nicole Bourbonnais, and I am absolutely grateful for her presence in my life. And actually, when I started my master's thesis, it was with the idea that because environment was also a huge part of what I studied. Most of my classes had a lot to do with environmental policy. And I came across a study about how Carnival is detrimental to the environment because of its philosophy, that everything, every year, from the music to the feathers to everything, has to be new. You can't wear what you wore to Carnival last year this year. And so they did a study in Trinidad about the environmental effects of Carnival, but also like how can you still produce new with the ethos of being more environmentally conscious. So I just thought, oh my God, that would be so cool to implement in St. Martin, so I could do a study similar. Boom, boom, lo and behold, there was no history of Carnival that I could use to even start from to do a study like that. So I was speaking with my professor, and she's like, why don't you just write the history? And I was like, okay, that's also super cool. So I came to St. Martin in 2017. I conducted the oral histories because I really looked at the institutions that planned Carnival. So not I would say like the cultural section of it, but the transformation from the Oranje Committee all the way down to SCDF and how they plan Carnival, because I was really interested actually in how the state works together with the idea of the people. Like, who is the government? Like, who are they? When we complain about government, who are we talking about? Are we talking about the prime minister? Are we talking about this fake ghost in the room, And indeed, like when we talk about the people, who are the people? Are they really united as we say they are, etc.? So I used Carnival to be able to speak about those topics and to document the history. And because I think I went through the organizing committee route, it was really easy because it was documented. I knew who to go to. And they were all willing and able to talk about the topic. And so in 2019, for the 50th anniversary, I got funding to print the book. And the idea, or my idea, or my ethos is just, it is the history of the people. I don't own it. So the book wasn't for sale, but I gave out free copies to all the schools that I could go to the library, to different persons within the community. I still have some copies. So if people want copies, they can always reach out to me. I'm trying to make it available as an ebook but for the ebook, because right now it exists as my master's thesis, right? For a master's thesis, you also have to explain methodology and all these things. So I've thought about redoing it as just the history itself, because I know that that's what people are interested in. They're not interested in the boxes that I had to check to get my degree. So I've been thinking of reformulating that, also including the front side.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, because...
And then a little update you'll have to add is, as of next year, I think it's 2023, if I'm not mistaken, they plan to put Carnival up for bid.
Okay.
So that's, even more
New developments.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, Carnival is something that I think is like always developing, and it also shows you my biggest thing. And I think not the historical part of Carnival, but the biggest outcome of my thesis was just like the way St. Martin government through the years has seen the management of culture. And Jamaica Kincaid is my favorite Caribbean author, and she writes that there is a minister of culture only in countries where there is no culture.
Wow.
Because there's this idea that there's this thing that exists and you need to manage it, hold on to it, and say that it exists. And I really thought about that as I thought about the way that St. Martin government basically first started out as the organizer of Carnival and then just let it go, for other outside entities to be able to organize it. But I think it's also really interesting to understand, like how does the St. Martin government see itself through the years, through changing persons and characters, and also for us to realize like that in itself is like a system, so sometimes we complain a lot about the things like that government doesn't do and government doesn't do this and they should control that, blah blah blah, but they don't control it also because that's the way they see a certain situation, right? Like they don't control culture because for them it's the cultural entity, and for them they are a checkbox, like they make sure that the police are there and that's their role, that there's a festival there, a festival village, that's their role. So I think we need to have more substantive conversations about, what does the role of government see itself as? And then again, as a people, we have to answer, do they need to do more? Do they need to do other things? But in St. Martin, throughout the years, throughout all these things, it has been private sector. It has been private organizations and individuals that have really taken up causes, carried causes.
True.
And I think that that's our strength as a people, that we have to realize that in all of our complaining about government, most of the time, what most of us do is turn around and we do it ourselves.
That's true.
And that's the glory of us, And so I think we need to also realize that strength in ourselves and celebrate it. And not in a way to knock government or say government isn't doing this, but like, hey, we are doing this as a people at the end of the day.
Yeah, and as well, just ensure that we hold government accountable as well for what they are supposed to do.
Exactly.
So with that, Carla, I'd like to thank you so much. I went a little over time, but I'll save the almost a dozen more questions I have for you for next time, because I know we could go on. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you as well for listening to today's program. That was joined in here with me was Miss Carla Vlaun, a policy advisor. I would even add an educator and a researcher. So take care.